Welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Ready to get our hands dirty with some serious thinking today.
Always up for a challenge. What are we diving into?
Well, we're tackling a trend that's frankly both fascinating and a little bit scary: the decline of expertise. We'll be using Tom Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise, to guide our conversation.
Oh, that's a good one. I'm familiar with Nichols's work. He doesn't shy away from controversy, does he?
Not at all. In fact, he opens the book with a pretty provocative statement. We're proud of not knowing things. Kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like when did ignorance become something to boast about?
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore today. How did we get here? Why are so many people quick to dismiss the opinions of those who have dedicated their lives to understanding a particular subject?
Right. It's like we've lost that respect for the years of study, the research, the experience that goes into becoming an expert.
Absolutely. So I guess the first question is, what exactly defines expertise? Is it just about having a fancy degree?
It's more than that, for sure. Expertise is a blend of things. Education, for sure.
Mm.
Talent plays a role too, natural aptitude. But then you've got to put in the time, the years of experience, the constant learning and refining of your craft.
Right. It's not
Yes.
something you achieve overnight. It's a process.
Exactly. And a big part of that process is, well, you need the recognition of other experts in your field, your peers. They're the ones who can really validate your expertise.
It's like that old saying, it takes one to know one.
Exactly. Nichols actually illustrates this with a great anecdote about Marshall Schulman, who was a leading expert on Soviet affairs during the Cold War.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
So when someone asked Schulman how he could possibly glean any meaning from those dense, cryptic Soviet newspapers, his response was classic. He said, "I just read Pravda until my nose twitches."
So it wasn't just about reading the words, but developing this, like, sixth sense for what was really being said,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. It's that deep, almost intuitive grasp of a subject that comes from immersing yourself in it for years. You develop a feel for the nuances, the subtleties.
You start to notice things that others might miss.
Right. But here's the thing. Nichols argues that there's been a shift in how we view expertise. We've gone from maybe being too deferential to experts, accepting everything they said without question.
To almost the opposite, where we're quick to dismiss them, maybe even resent them.
Exactly. And he connects this shift to Tocqueville's observations about American democracy way back in the 19th century. Tocqueville noticed that Americans had this inherent distrust of authority, especially intellectual authority.
It's like we're suspicious of anyone who claims to know more than we do.
Which, to a certain extent, it's healthy to be skeptical, to question things. But there's a difference between healthy skepticism and outright dismissal of expertise.
And I think part of the problem is that, well, let's face it, experts DO get things wrong sometimes. Think about all the flip-flopping on nutrition advice over the years. 1 minute eggs are bad for you, the next they're a superfood. It's enough to make anyone wonder who to believe.
Oh, absolutely. No expert is infallible, and Nichols acknowledges that. But he also makes a really important point. Just because experts can be wrong sometimes doesn't invalidate the entire system of expertise.
It's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Precisely. It's about understanding that expertise is a process, not a destination.
Okay, so how do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory ideas? Experts can be wrong, but we still need to value expertise.
Well, that's where understanding human psychology comes in. We all have biases, ways of thinking that can lead us astray, and Nichols dives into some of those like confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. So that's the tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, right?
Exactly. We tend to gravitate towards sources that reinforce our existing views, even if those views are based on flawed information or incomplete understanding. And this can be really dangerous, especially in the age of the internet and social media.
It's like we're creating these echo chambers where everyone's just agreeing with each other and dissenting voices are drowned out.
Exactly. And it makes it really hard to have productive conversations or to challenge our own assumptions. And then there's this other fascinating psychological phenomenon that Nichols explores, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's isn't it the idea that incompetent people are often the least aware of their incompetence?
Exactly. They lack the what's called metacognition, the ability to step back and assess their own knowledge objectively.
And this leads them to overestimate their abilities.
Precisely. They think they know more than they actually do, and they're often the most confident in their opinions, even when those opinions are totally off base. Remember that study from Cornell where they presented people with a list of scientific terms?
Oh, yeah. And some of them were completely made up, right? Like chromatic induction or something.
Exactly. And a staggering 90% of people claim to know at least something about these bogus terms.
It's like, wow, we really do have a tendency to overestimate our own knowledge.
We do. And that overconfidence combined with things like confirmation bias and our inherent desire for simple explanations can make us really susceptible to misinformation, even conspiracy theories.
It's like we're wired to believe what feels good, even if it's not true.
It's a real challenge, and it's made even more complicated by the way higher education has evolved in recent years.
You'd think more education would lead to a greater appreciation for expertise, right?
Hmm.
But Nichols seems to argue that it's actually part of the problem.
He does, and one of the key factors he points to is the commodification of education. It's become more about treating students like customers rather than learners.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I remember when I was applying to colleges, it felt more like I was shopping for a luxury vacation package than an education. The brochures were all about the dorms, the dining options, the fitness centers, not so much about the academic rigor or the quality of the professors.
That's a perfect example of what Nichols calls client servicing in higher education. Colleges are competing for students, like businesses compete for customers, and the focus is on providing a pleasurable experience rather than challenging students intellectually.
It's like we've lost sight of the true purpose of education. It's become about getting that piece of paper, that degree, rather than actually learning and growing.
And this, Nichols argues, diminishes the value of a degree and contributes to a decline in respect for expertise. When degrees are seen as mere commodities rather than symbols of hard-earned knowledge and critical thinking skills, it's no wonder people are less inclined to trust those with advanced degrees.
And he also talks about grade inflation, right? Like how getting an A doesn't mean what it used to.
Exactly. When everyone's getting top marks, it devalues the meaning of academic achievement. And it contributes to this sense of entitlement among students, this expectation that they deserve good grades regardless of effort or actual learning.
And then there's this whole issue with student evaluations of professors, right? It seems like they've become less about providing constructive feedback and more about, like, rating the professor's performance as an entertainer.
It's true. And this can create a chilling effect on professors, making them hesitant to challenge students or to present controversial ideas for fear of getting negative evaluations. Nichols even shares some pretty horrifying examples of student evaluations where professors are subjected to personal attacks and absurd demands that have nothing to do with the course content.
So the institutions that are supposed to be nurturing critical thinking and respect for knowledge are, in some ways, contributing to the very problem they're supposed to be solving. It's a bit ironic, isn't it?
It is, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room. I mean, we have BE to talk about the internet and how that's playing into all of this.
Right. The internet. The ultimate double-edged sword. On one hand, it's this incredible tool for accessing information. But on the other, it's become a breeding ground for misinformation and
Wow.
conspiracy theories.
Exactly. By 2014, there were over 1 billion websites online.
1 billion.
Yeah. And as Nichols reminds us, Sturgeon's law applies here. 90% of everything is crud. The internet amplifies this, making it harder than ever to sift through the noise and find reliable information.
It's like searching for a needle in a haystack of dubious claims.
It really is. And this easy access to information, ironically, can lead to what Nichols calls an illusion of knowledge. Just because you can Google something doesn't mean you understand it or that the information you're finding is accurate.
We're mistaking information for knowledge.
Exactly. And this is compounded by the way news is reported today. We're constantly bombarded with information from a million different sources, and it's hard to know what to believe.
You're talking about the 24-hour news cycle.
Right. This constant stream of headlines and breaking news creates a sense of urgency, but it also makes it difficult to separate the signal from the noise. And often, the focus is on sensationalism and entertainment rather than in-depth analysis and nuanced reporting.
It's like we're all becoming headline readers, skimming the surface without really diving deep into the issues. And this contributes to that information overload you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. And it's exhausting. It makes it hard to focus, to think critically, to discern what's really important, and it creates this perfect storm for the decline of expertise. It really is a lot to process, isn't it? This whole idea that we're drowning in information but starving for wisdom.
It is, yeah. And, it's easy to get overwhelmed and just tune it all out. But Nichols argues that giving into that temptation is actually part of the problem. We can't just throw our hands up and say, well, nobody knows anything anymore, so why bother?
Right. It's not about giving up on expertise altogether, but about understanding how to evaluate it critically, how to discern who to trust, and how to navigate this incredibly complex information landscape.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How do we do that? What are some practical steps we can take to become more discerning consumers of information?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that even the smartest people, the most qualified experts, can make mistakes.
Right, we talked about that earlier. Nobody's perfect.
Exactly. And Nichols actually spends a good chunk of the book breaking down the ways in which experts can fail. And he identifies a few categories. Thankfully, the most serious one, deliberate deception, is pretty rare.
You're talking about like outright fraud, right?
Yeah.
Falsifying data, plagiarism, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And Nichols points out that those cases are incredibly damaging because they erode public trust in the entire system of expertise. But they're also really hard to detect, especially for those of us who aren't experts ourselves.
It's like we have to rely on other experts to catch the bad apples.
Yeah.
But what happens when they miss something or when they're complicit in the deception?
Right. It makes you realize that the system is only as good as the people in it. And humans, as we know, are flawed. But thankfully, there are safeguards in place, like peer review, which is supposed to weed out bad research or unethical behavior.
So other experts in the field scrutinizing each other's work before it's published or accepted as valid. It's like a checks and balances system for knowledge.
Exactly. But even peer review isn't foolproof. And Nichols even points to the increasing number of retractions from scientific journals as a sign that the system isn't always working as it should.
So it's not a guarantee, but it's at least an attempt to hold experts accountable.
It is. And it's important to remember that science and knowledge in general is a process. It's constantly evolving, self-correcting. So mistakes happen, but they're usually identified and corrected over time.
It's about progress, not perfection. Okay, so we've got deliberate deception, which is rare but damaging. What other ways can experts go wrong?
Well, sometimes experts overstep the boundaries of their expertise. You'll have a brilliant chemist who suddenly starts making claims about nutrition or child development, things that are outside their area of specialization.
Oh yeah, I've seen that. It's like when a celebrity suddenly becomes an expert on vaccines or climate change just because they have a platform.
Exactly. And that's where we, as consumers of information, need to be really careful. We need to look at the relevance of an expert's credentials. Are they actually qualified to speak on this particular issue? Have their claims been vetted by other experts in that specific field?
So it's not enough to just take someone's word for it because they have a PhD or they've written a book.
Yeah.
We need to look at the specific area of expertise.
Exactly. And this is especially important when it comes to predictions.
To predictions.
Yeah, like when experts are asked to predict the future, whether it's the economy, election outcomes, you name it. But as Nichols points out, their track record isn't always great.
You're reminding me of that research by Philip Tetlock. He analyzed thousands of expert predictions and found that they were often no more accurate than chance.
Exactly. And while this research doesn't mean that we should completely discount expert opinions, it does underscore the limitations of prediction, especially when it comes to complex systems.
So we shouldn't expect experts to have a crystal ball.
Right. And we need to be realistic about what they can and cannot know.
And I think sometimes we, the public, demand too much certainty from experts, especially in areas where the future is inherently uncertain.
It's true. We want black and white answers, but often the reality is much more nuanced and complex.
And it's important to remember that experts are human too, right? They have their own biases, their own blind spots.
Absolutely. They're susceptible to the same cognitive biases and emotional influences as the rest of us. Confirmation bias, groupthink, you name it.
So they can get caught up in their own echo chambers, just like we can.
They can. And that's why it's so important to have diverse perspectives within expert communities. It helps to guard against those biases, to make sure that decisions are based on evidence and careful analysis, not just personal opinions or groupthink.
It's like that old saying, two heads are better than one. But in this case, it's more like many heads are better than one.
Right, exactly. The more perspectives we have, the better our chances of getting closer to the truth.
So, okay, we've talked about how experts can go wrong. But how do we, as non-experts, actually go about evaluating information and deciding who to trust? It feels a bit like we're being asked to be amateur detectives, constantly scrutinizing everyone's credentials and motivations.
I understand that feeling. It can be overwhelming. But Nichols' point isn't to make us all paranoid skeptics. It's about finding that balance between respecting expertise and recognizing its limitations.
So it's not about rejecting expertise altogether. It's about being more discerning, more thoughtful about how we engage with it.
Exactly. And one of the most important things we can do is to cultivate a sense of intellectual humility.
Humility, you mean admitting that we don't know everything.
Exactly. And that's okay. In fact, recognizing that we don't have all the answers is the first step to actually learning.
It's like that saying, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Right. And once we acknowledge our own limitations, we're more open to hearing from others, even those who might have different perspectives or expertise than we do. And then it becomes about being skeptical, but not cynical.
Okay, explain that one. What's the difference?
Skepticism is about questioning things, looking for evidence, being willing to challenge your own assumptions. Cynicism is about assuming the worst, believing that everyone is out to deceive you, that there's no such thing as truth or objective knowledge.
So skepticism is healthy, cynicism is paralyzing.
Exactly. And cynicism, I think, is one of the biggest obstacles to constructive dialogue and to finding solutions to complex problems.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we question things without becoming completely disillusioned?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing our own biases. We all have them, and they can influence how we interpret information.
So be aware of what you're bringing to the table, your own preconceived notions and assumptions.
Exactly. And then when you're evaluating information, try to do it from a place of curiosity, not judgment. Ask yourself, what's the evidence for this claim? What are the potential biases of the person making this claim? Are there other perspectives that I need to consider?
It's like being a good journalist. Fact check, consider multiple sources, look for evidence to support or refute claims.
Exactly. And be willing to change your mind. That's a big one.
Oh man, that one's tough. And nobody likes to admit they were wrong.
It's true. But changing your mind when presented with new evidence or a more convincing argument is actually a sign of intellectual honesty and growth.
It's about being open to learning, even if it means letting go of some of your cherished beliefs.
Exactly. And that's something we need to model for others, especially younger generations. We need to show them that it's okay to be wrong, that learning is a lifelong process, and that changing your mind is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength.
So we've spent a good chunk of time really digging into the factors that are contributing to this decline of expertise.
And it's pretty clear, isn't it? It's not a simple problem.
Not at all. It's multifaceted. It's got roots in, well, everything from human psychology and the structure of higher education to the way we consume news in this digital age.
Right. And that can be a bit disheartening, can it? It makes you wonder, like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it can feel a little hopeless at times.
But thankfully, Nichols doesn't just leave us hanging in the death of expertise. He offers some, well, I'd say some practical advice for how we can move forward. He suggests, for example, that the responsibility lies with both experts and non-experts to bridge this growing gap. It's not just one side's fault.
It's a two-way street. I like that. So let's start with us, the non-experts. What can we do to become more informed and, well, more discerning citizens, I guess?
Well, Nichols really emphasizes this idea of intellectual humility. It's recognizing that we don't know everything and being open to learning from those who have dedicated their lives, their careers, to understanding a particular field.
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? We often celebrate the idea of lifelong learning, but then we turn around and dismiss the very people who embody that concept, the expert.
Yeah, it's like we say we value knowledge, but then we don't trust the people who have it. It's a weird contradiction.
It is, yeah. It's strange. So intellectual humility, that's a good starting point. And what else? What other practical steps can we take?
Well, it goes hand in hand with that idea, I think. It's the importance of being skeptical, but not cynical.
Okay, you keep saying that.
Yeah.
Skeptical but not cynical. Explain the difference again.
Sure. Skepticism is about questioning things, looking for evidence, being willing to challenge your own assumptions.
So like not just accepting things at face value.
Right. And not just believing everything you read or hear, even if it comes from someone who seems like an authority.
But cynicism, that's different.
Yeah, cynicism is more about assuming the worst.
Like everyone's lying or has an agenda.
Yeah. It's believing that there's no such thing as truth or objective knowledge. And that can be really dangerous.
Because if you believe that, then there's no point in even trying to figure things out, right?
Exactly. Cynicism is paralyzing. It shuts down conversation. It prevents us from learning and growing.
So skepticism is healthy. Cynicism is, well, it's toxic, I guess.
I think that's a good way to put it. And it's so easy to fall into that trap, especially with all the negativity and polarization we see online these days.
It's everywhere you look. So how do we How do we stay skeptical without becoming completely cynical?
Well, I think a big part of it is being aware of our own biases, those preconceived notions and assumptions that we all carry around with us.
So recognize that you're coming to every issue with your own baggage.
Right. And be willing to set that aside and try to see things from different perspectives.
That's easier said than done, though, isn't it?
It is. It takes practice. But I think it's also about asking the right questions. When you encounter a new piece of information, ask yourself, what's the evidence for this claim? Who's making this claim? What are their credentials? What are their potential biases? Are there other perspectives that I need to consider?
It's like being a good detective.
Exactly. And then, perhaps the most challenging one, be willing to change your mind.
Oof, that's a tough one. It's hard to admit you're wrong, especially if you've been, like, really attached to a belief for a long time.
It's true, but I think, if we're truly committed to learning and growing, we have to be open to changing our minds. And that's something, it's a skill, I guess, that we need to model for others, especially younger generations.
Show them that it's okay to be wrong, that it doesn't mean you're stupid or weak.
Right. It just means you're learning. It's part of the process.
Okay, so that's what we can do as individuals. But what about the experts themselves? What can they do to rebuild trust, to help bridge this gap?
Well, I think some of the same principles apply. They need to be humble. They need to be aware of their own biases.
A little dose of their own medicine.
Exactly. They need to acknowledge that they don't have all the answers, that their recommendations are based on the best available evidence, but that evidence can change over time.
And they need to be transparent about that, right?
Yes, absolutely. And they also need to, I think, become better communicators.
Because it's not enough to just, like, publish your research in some obscure academic journal, right?
Right. It needs to be accessible to a wider audience. And that means finding ways to translate complex ideas into language that, that the average person can understand. And that's where, those public intellectuals we talked about earlier can really come in handy.
Yeah, the ones who could take really complex ideas and, make them both understandable and interesting.
Right. Experts should be collaborating with them, working together to make knowledge more engaging and more accessible to a wider audience.
Okay, so we've got humility, better communication. Anything else?
One more thing. I think it's really important for experts to be more engaged citizens themselves, not just as experts, but as informed members of society.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, vote, participate in the political process, advocate for policies they believe in, speak out against misinformation.
Lead by example, basically.
Exactly.
So it's a two-way street. We all have a role to play in this, whether we're experts or not.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Tom Nichols' book, The Death of Expertise. It's a sobering book in many ways.
It is, yeah.
But it's also hopeful, I think. It doesn't just present the problem. It offers some solutions, some ways forward.
Right. And I think the key takeaway is that we need to work together on this.
We can't afford to give up on expertise. We need it now more than ever.
Absolutely. We need to restore trust and knowledge and make sure that that evidence-based decision-making prevails.
Well said. So, to our listener, remember, be curious, question everything, but do it with humility and respect, and never stop learning.
We all have a role to play in shaping a future where knowledge thrives.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful. And until next time, keep those minds sharp.